In the freezing darkness of the Tower of London, 1546, a sound echoed through the stone walls that was so sickening, it haunted the guards for the rest of their lives. It wasn't a scream. It was the wet, grinding pop of a human shoulder socket being torn cleanly from its joint. The air in the chamber was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of nervous sweat from the executioners themselves. But the true horror wasn't the bone snapping. It was the silence that followed and the cold calculation of the men standing around the machine. You are about to enter the darkest chapter of Tudor history where the rack wasn't just a torture device, it was a weapon precision engineered to turn womanhood itself into a battlefield. This isn't your standard history lesson about Dungeons and Dragons. We are peeling back the layers of a conspiracy that forensic historians are only now beginning to fully understand. The Tudor regime didn't just want to hurt women, they wanted to dismantle them. They viewed the female body not as a vessel of life, but as a territory of rebellion that needed to be mapped, conquered, and violently reshaped. They hired engineers, anatomists, and sadists to modify the rack specifically to exploit the biological differences of the female body. This was gender-targeted warfare, designed to take the very hips used for childbirth and rip them apart until the victim was nothing but a bag of fluid and shattered bone. But here is the twist that history tried to bury. This machine, built to ensure total dominance, eventually met an enemy it couldn't break. How does a device made of iron and oak get destroyed by the sheer will of a single woman? To understand this nightmare, we have to look at the architect of pain, Thomas Norton. In 1540, this master engineer approached Henry VIII not with a weapon of war, but with blueprints for a new kind of hell. Norton realized that the traditional rack, which stretched limbs evenly, was too merciful for the female frame. He argued that because women possessed a wider pelvic structure for childbirth, the machine needed to target the ligaments of the lower torso specifically to achieve maximum agony. His solution? Asymmetric tension. He redesigned the machine with adjustable iron clamps that could isolate the pelvic joints. This meant that when the gears turned, a woman's body wouldn't just stretch. Her pelvis would suffer catastrophic internal ruptures, tearing the ligaments that hold the spine to the hips. Norton didn't stop there. He introduced the birthing restraint, a position that forced women to lie with their knees splayed and spine arched, a grotesque mockery of childbirth. This specific posture was chosen to inflict deep psychological shame, stripping the victim of her dignity before the physical pain even began. It was psychological terror fused with physical agony. They wanted these women to feel that their capacity to give life was being used to destroy them. Court physicians actually stood by with sketches, pointing out the weakest points of muscle and tissue, so the torturers knew exactly when to turn the crank for maximum devastation. It was science weaponized against the soul. Now, imagine you are strapped into this machine. The metal is cold against your skin, your wrists are bound, and you hear the ratchet click one tooth at a time. Click. Your shoulders dislocate. Click. Your hips begin to separate. But just when you think you've reached the limit of pain, a new monster steps out of the shadows with a plan to break your mind. Enter Richard Topcliffe, a man so sadistic he makes typical executioners look like saints. By 1581, he had become the Crown's chief interrogator, and he brought with him a leather-bound journal that would become the Manual of Psychological Torture. Topcliffe didn't just want to break bones, he wanted to rewire the human brain. He invented the Enhanced Persuasion Protocol, a two-stage nightmare. He believed that by alternating extreme physical compression with extreme stretching, he could force the victim's mind into a state of psychotic gratitude for any moment of stillness. First, he used the Scavenger's Daughter, a metal loop that crushed the body into a fetal position until the ribs cracked and the lungs collapsed. Then, immediately after crushing them, he threw them onto the rack to stretch them out. This rapid switch from compression to expansion sent the nervous system into absolute shock. The muscles, confused by the contradictory signals of crushing and tearing, would often spasm
Such beauty
uncontrollably,
shouldn't be ruined.
adding an involuntary layer of
Just
torment to the
confess,
process.
and perhaps I'll be
The body no
merciful.
longer knew where the pain began or ended. It was a total physiological collapse. But Topcliffe's sickest innovation was his timing. He meticulously tracked the menstrual cycles of his prisoners. He scheduled the most brutal sessions during their most vulnerable days, weaponizing their own hormones against them to ensure emotional resilience was at rock bottom. He documented everything with chilling pride, noting that victims would eventually enter a gratitude phase, thanking him for stopping the pain for just a second. He thought he had created the perfect system of control. But he was wrong. He pushed one woman too far, and instead of a confession, he got a revolution. Her name was Anne Askew, and she was the first crack in the system. For hours, they turned the wheels until her body was essentially destroyed, yet she refused to name her accomplices. She had to be carried to her execution in a chair because her bones were so dislocated she could no longer stand, yet she preached to the crowd until the flames took her. But the real turning point came years later with a woman named Margaret Clitheroe. In 1558, the Tower of London prepared for just another execution, another broken woman. But Margaret was different. She was a 43-year-old mother, broad-shouldered from farm work, and possessing a will of iron that scared even the guards. Margaret wasn't just accused of harboring priests, she was guilty of defying the very logic of their power. When they strapped her to the rack, she didn't beg. She watched them. She studied the machine like a mechanic looking at a broken engine. The torturers, used to the frantic pleading of their victims, found themselves hesitating under her gaze, feeling a sudden, inexplicable loss of authority. The chief executioner, William Hartwell, noted in his log that she displayed no fear, only a cold, analytical gaze. It unnerved them. They were used to screams, not silence. They were used to victims, not judges. As the tension increased, Margaret started doing the unthinkable. She began critiquing their technique. "Your left pulley is uneven," she told them calmly, her voice steady despite the agony. Imagine the scene, a woman being torn apart, correcting the men killing her. And then the machine began to groan. By the 7th hour, the torture chamber had turned into a theater of the absurd. Margaret was engaging the executioners in a psychological battle, dismantling their gratitude protocol with pure logic. She spoke to them not as a prisoner, but as a disappointed teacher, pointing out that their reliance on pain proved they had no real truth on their side. She told them, "You rely on despair, but despair loses its power when a mind refuses to participate." Every word was a slap in the face to their authority. The guards were sweating, panic setting in as they realized the script had flipped. They cranked the machine harder, desperate to hear her scream, desperate to regain control. But the laws of physics and the limits of cruelty were about to be tested. The rack was groaning under the strain, the wood creaking, the iron gears grinding against the resistance of a body that simply would not yield. Dust began to fall from the ceiling rafters as the tension in the room, both physical and metaphysical, reached a breaking point. Hartwell wrote frantically in his notes, "Instrument weakens, structural compromise imminent." They had pushed the machine beyond its design, trying to break a spirit that was unbreakable. The air in the chamber grew heavy with the smell of friction and fear. The fear of the torturers, not the victim. Then, at hour 15, it happened. A sound like a gunshot rang out, but it didn't come from Margaret's bones. It came from the machine. Crack. The central beam of the rack split down its spine. The massive oak timber, designed to withstand the force of tearing grown men apart, shattered under the weight of its own cruelty. Splinters of wood exploded into the air, and the tension cables whipped back violently, narrowly missing the executioners who scrambled away in terror. Margaret Clitheroe lay on the ruins of the device, her body twisted and broken, but her spirit untouched. The machine had failed. For the first time in history, the victim had outlasted the torture device. She looked up at the terrified executioners and whispered words that should be etched in fire. "I have learned the weakness of men who mistake cruelty for power." Margaret died soon after, not from the rack, but from the sheer exhaustion of the ordeal. But the damage was done. The story of the woman who broke the rack spread through London like wildfire. Commoners whispered her name in the streets as a saint of defiance, turning her execution into a legendary victory that the crown could not suppress. It was whispered in taverns, in markets, in the very courts of the king. The ultimate weapon of the patriarchy had been humiliated. 6 months later, Henry VIII ordered that specific rack dismantled, citing mechanical issues, but everyone knew the truth. The spell was broken. Interrogators began to hesitate. If a farm woman could defeat the machine, what power did they really have? The rate of confessions plummeted. The state realized that public torture was no longer creating fear. It was creating martyrs. But as the physical racks disappeared, the system didn't stop. It just evolved. The Tower of London is quiet today. Tourists walk over the spots where women screamed, taking selfies where blood once pooled. They gaze at the polished armor and the crown jewels, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet is saturated with the silent history of gendered violence. The iron is gone, rusted away by time. But do not be fooled into thinking the torture ended. Historians call this the migration of cruelty. When overt physical torture becomes a liability, the system shifts to psychological and social control. The rack didn't die. It turned into laws, institutions, and invisible norms that continue to police women's bodies to this day. The blueprint that Norton and Topcliffe created, targeting the biology, breaking the identity, erasing the voice, is still used in modern conflict zones and oppressive regimes. The logic remains identical. If you can control the body, you can control the mind, and if you can control the mind, you own the population. They just don't use wooden wheels anymore. They use shame, silence, and legislation. Margaret Clitheroe's story is not just a dusty historical anecdote. It is a manual for survival. She showed us that systems of oppression rely entirely on our participation in their fear. When we stop believing in the monster loses its teeth. Margaret proved that even when you are strapped down, stripped bare, and surrounded by enemies, you still have one final weapon: the refusal to yield. So, what is the legacy of the rack? It's not the pain, it's the realization that cruelty is actually fragile. It reveals that the oppressor is often more afraid than the oppressed, terrified that their tools of intimidation will one day stop working. It requires the victim's agreement to work. Topcliffe and Norton were men of science and engineering, smart men, yet they were defeated by a woman who simply refused to play their game. That is the most dangerous idea of all to those in power: that their machines can break, their protocols can fail, and their victims can stare back. As you go about your life, remember the sound of that wood snapping in 1558. Not the sound of a woman breaking, but the sound of tyranny collapsing under the weight of human will. Let that sound be a reminder that no system is invincible, and no silence is eternal as long as someone has the courage to endure. The machine is still out there, humming in quieter rooms, trying to make us afraid. But we have the blueprint to destroy it. If this story of defiance set a fire in your belly, don't let it go out. Hit that subscribe button and share this video, because every time we tell Margaret's story, we strike another blow against the silence they tried to enforce. What form of modern torture do you think society still uses to control women today? Let's get a real conversation started in the comments. I'll see you in the next video, where we uncover more secrets they didn't want you to know.